Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a moment in history where the entire world literally held its breath. I want you to picture the reality of Europe in the year 1917. Put aside the maps and the troop movements for just a second and imagine a continent that is completely trapped in a grim, unyielding global stalemate. The trenches stretched out for hundreds of miles, carving this permanent, bloody scar right across the landscape. Every single nation involved still believed victory was possible, but the cost was becoming entirely unimaginable.
3. That's how many grueling years the Great War had already been dragging on. Millions of soldiers had already died in the mud and the wire. And back at home, entire cities had been fundamentally transformed. They weren't centers of culture or regular commerce anymore. They'd become massive, churning factories producing literally nothing but weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and supplies. It was total war. And honestly, the continent was just bleeding dry.
Every army was pushed to its absolute limit. By 1917, Europe was simply exhausted. The outcome of the Great War wasn't just about who had the best tactics anymore. Instead, it was going to come down to one desperate, incredibly high-stakes race against time. Because across the Atlantic Ocean, one industrial giant, the United States, still stood totally outside the conflict, officially neutral. Okay, let's dive into this and see exactly how the dominoes began to fall.
Section 1. Germany's Fatal Gambles and the U-Boat Campaign.
So to understand how this massive stalemate broke, we really have to look at Germany's strategy. Germany knew it couldn't defeat Britain on land, so they turned to the sea. They launched this desperate campaign using a silent, deadly weapon right beneath the Atlantic waves, the submarine or the U-boat. Their mission was brutally simple: cut Britain's supply lines and literally starve the island nation into surrender. Which brings us to this critical strategy: unrestricted submarine warfare. At first, German submarines only targeted military cargo, but soon they shifted to a policy where they'd attack almost any ship entering British waters without any warning at all. It was incredibly effective for sure, but it was also a massive gamble. Why? Because neutral nations, including the United States, had citizens and merchant ships crossing that ocean every single day. Germany was seriously risking pulling a sleeping giant into the war.
Moving on to Section 2, the sinking of the Lusitania. May 7, 1915.
On May 7, 1915, the British passenger liner, the RMS Lusitania, was sailing from New York to Liverpool. There were nearly 2,000 passengers on board, just making a standard transatlantic crossing. And then, without a single warning, a German U-boat fired a torpedo. Moments later, a second explosion ripped right through the hull. 18 minutes. That is literally all it took for this massive, towering passenger liner to completely disappear beneath the Atlantic Ocean. The terrifying speed of this disaster left the passengers and crew with almost zero time to escape.
The resulting death toll was just staggering. Almost 1,200 people lost their lives in those freezing waters. Now, Germany attempted to defend the strike, claiming that the passenger ship was secretly carrying military supplies. But the sheer loss of civilian life, it sent a shockwave of absolute horror across the globe.
But here is the number that really changed history: 128. Among the dead were 128 American citizens. Newspapers across the United States printed these heartbreaking images and highly emotional headlines. Before this, President Woodrow Wilson had promised to keep the country out of Europe's war, and a lot of Americans agreed with him. But after the Lusitania, trust in Germany began rapidly fading. The American public started to seriously question whether neutrality was even a realistic option anymore.
Let's look at Section 3, the Zimmermann Telegram, a secret intercepted.
Now, despite the outrage, America actually stayed out. But 2 years later, in January 1917, Germany made an even more explosive mistake. If the Lusitania lit the fuse, this next event was the bomb going off. Let's walk through this astonishing sequence of events step by step. Step 1. Germany's Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann sends a secret telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico with a wild proposal. He says, if the U.S. enters the war, Mexico should attack America. And in return, Germany would help Mexico recover Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Step 2. British intelligence intercepts this message. Step 3. The British brilliantly reveal it to the U.S. government. And finally, Step 4. The contents are published in American newspapers for absolutely everyone to read over their morning coffee.
The reaction? I mean, it was nothing short of explosive. Imagine waking up and reading that a foreign power is actively plotting to have your borders invaded.
Combined with the fact that Germany had just resumed their unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking more American ships and taking more American lives, public anger just boiled right over. Millions of Americans were now absolutely convinced that Germany posed a direct existential threat to the United States. Neutrality was officially dead.
On April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson stood before Congress. He delivered one of the most famous speeches in American history, delivering this powerful decree: the world must be made safe for democracy. Let the weight of that linger for a second, because just 4 days later, Congress officially voted to declare war on Germany. The United States had entered World War I.
Which brings us to Section 4. America awakens. The industrial giant mobilizes. At first, America's army was actually relatively small, but what America lacked in a standing army, it made up for with unmatched industrial strength. Almost overnight, factories expanded their operations massively. Millions of young men either volunteered or were drafted into military service. The industrial giant had awakened, and a tidal wave of fresh troops began preparing to cross the Atlantic. And this brilliantly illustrates the massive shift in dynamics. You had the European allies on one side, exhausted, depleted, fighting in the mud for years. And then you have the American Expeditionary Forces, or AEF, led by General John J. Pershing. Pershing insisted his soldiers fight as an independent force, and while they were pretty inexperienced, they brought exactly what the Allies desperately needed: fresh manpower, soaring confidence, and incredible energy. Hope had officially returned to the Western Front.
Now, a sharp pivot. Section 5, the Russian collapse. Revolution in the East.
But as America was busy setting up training camps across France and learning modern battlefield tactics, we have to pivot abruptly to the Eastern Front, because while America was preparing to fight, Russia was completely falling apart. Years of brutal fighting had utterly devastated the Russian nation. It was just this cascading series of failures. They faced severe food shortages, factories that could barely operate. Millions of Russian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. This immense suffering led to public anger totally exploding in the streets of Petrograd, which actually forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, collapsing over 3 centuries of Romanov rule. Out of all this chaos rose Vladimir Lenin's Bolsheviks, who captured the public support with one simple, powerful promise: peace.
Tracing this timeline shows you just how fast a global superpower can exit a war. Early 1917 sees the monarchy collapse. By later that year, the Bolsheviks seize power. And then the critical moment, March 1918, the new Bolshevik government signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany. So the crucial point is this: Russia was officially out of the war. Suddenly, Germany was able to transfer hundreds of thousands of experienced, battle-hardened soldiers from the Eastern Front straight to the Western Front.
Which brings us to the ultimate nail-biting question of the entire war. Could Germany win before American power arrived? The German commanders knew the clock was ticking, and it was ticking loudly. If they waited too long, the United States would simply overwhelm them with endless men, weapons, and supplies. They had this massive influx of troops from the east, yes, but a very, very narrow window of time to use them.
Setting up Section 6, the last great gamble, the spring offensive of 1918.
Because of that ticking clock, Germany prepared to throw absolutely everything they had into one last, frantic, massive push along the Western Front. Germany deployed these specially trained stormtroopers using brand new infiltration tactics, and initially, it was terrifyingly successful. They completely broke through the Allied positions. For weeks, the Germans advanced farther than they had in years, pushing so deep that Paris itself once again came under direct threat. For a fleeting moment, a German victory genuinely seemed possible.
But that initial success carried a fatal flaw. It became a battle of momentum versus exhaustion. Yes, they had a rapid advance, finally breaking the deadlock of the trenches, but they were moving way too fast. Their supply lines were stretched ridiculously thin. The advancing German soldiers were fundamentally exhausted, and food and ammunition became incredibly scarce. They had the momentum, sure, but they were literally starving.
And right at that critical moment of German exhaustion, the Americans arrived. Fresh American divisions entered the fighting, not just in small groups, but by the hundreds of thousands, in ever-growing numbers. They stepped right into the gaps, meeting those starving, exhausted German forces with an absolute wall of fresh energy and endless supplies.
The balance of the war shifted dramatically and permanently. Germany had thrown absolutely everything into that one final attack, and it had failed. Now, with the Allies preparing a massive counteroffensive, backed by an endless stream of U.S. reinforcements, the writing was on the wall. Germany's defeat was no longer a question of if, the stalemate was finally broken.
The Great War was finally marching toward its bitter end. But as we close out this explainer, I really want to leave you with this thought. With the ticking clock finally running out on Germany and the map of Europe completely shattered, how would the world reshape itself after the guns finally fell silent? Millions were dead, empires had collapsed, and a brand new global superpower had just stepped onto the world stage. The war was ending, but the consequences were just beginning. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.
All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to explore how a desperately ticking clock essentially forced Germany into launching its largest offensive of the war, only to suffer a complete, catastrophic collapse just 8 months later. I mean, after 4 years of absolutely unimaginable bloodshed, the final chapter of this conflict was just wild. It's defined by these rapid shifts in momentum, desperate last-ditch pushes, and ultimately, the total implosion of an empire. To really grasp how this all went down, you've got to put yourself in the mindset of the German High Command in the spring of 1918. For them, time was quite literally running out. Every single week, thousands of fresh American soldiers were pouring into France. And across the Atlantic, U.S. factories were churning out millions of tons of supplies at a pace Germany simply couldn't compete with. If Germany just sat back and waited, defeat was a mathematical certainty. They knew they had to act before this massive tidal wave of industrial might crashed right down on them. Part 1. Germany's last desperate gamble. 1 million. Take a second to really think about that number. On March 21st, 1918, Germany launched Operation Michael, and this wasn't just some minor skirmish. It was the absolute largest offensive of the entire war. By unleashing over 1 million soldiers against British positions along the Western Front, Germany was literally putting every single chip they had left on the table. But to make this massive numbers game actually work, Germany had to execute a major tactical shift. Instead of just throwing brutal human waves of infantry to die against static trenches, which, let's be honest, hadn't worked for years, they changed the game. They deployed these elite stormtroopers using specialized infiltration tactics, often called hoot-your tactics. These units completely bypassed the heavy defenses, slipped right through the weak points, and struck directly at enemy headquarters in the rear. And amazingly, it worked. For the first time in forever, the static trenches actually began to move. The result was a staggering 40-mile advance. Now, in World War I terms, 40 miles is huge. Entire Allied divisions were just totally routed. Suddenly, Paris seemed within reach again, so much so that the Germans even started shelling the city from 75 miles away using these massive railway guns. For one fleeting, tantalizing second, after years of a brutal stalemate, Germany actually believed they were going to win. Which brings us to part 2, the tide turns. So the problem for Germany was that every single mile they advanced came at a terrible, terrible price. They were pushing forward so fast that they actually outran their own supply wagons. Ammunition was dwindling, and the troops out front were absolutely starving. In fact, in one of the great ironies of this massive push, German soldiers actually halted their own attacks just so they could gorge on captured Allied food rations. Meanwhile, as they're starving and exhausted, they are crashing headfirst into fresh, highly motivated American troops who are arriving daily. So yes, Germany had won ground, but they completely exhausted their army to get it. And all of this exhaustion comes to a head in July 1918, at the Second Battle of the Marne. Germany tried to launch yet another offensive, but this time the Allies were waiting for them. It triggered a massive, highly coordinated counterattack by French, British, and American forces. And the fighting here was just incredibly brutal. We're talking machine guns echoing through thick forests, artillery turning green fields into cratered moonscapes, and entire positions being decided by desperate hand-to-hand combat. This is where American soldiers really proved their mettle, in places like Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry, flat out refusing to retreat. When the dust finally settled, Germany was handed a devastating defeat. The momentum had permanently shifted. From this point on, the Allies were on the attack, and Germany was stuck playing defense. Moving on to part 3, the 100 Days Offensive. Picture this. British tanks are smashing right through defenses, French artillery is relentlessly pounding the trenches, and combined Allied forces are pushing forward without giving an inch. For the very first time since 1914, Germany was retreating everywhere. The shock of this was so profound that German General Erich Ludendorff famously dubbed August 8th the Black Day of the German Army. Entire units were just surrendering. The psychological back of the German High Command was officially broken right then and there. And hey, look, here is that massive number 1 million again. But this time, the shoe is on the other foot. This represents the more than 1 million American soldiers participating in the Meuse-Argonne offensive throughout September and October. This was literally one of the largest military operations in U.S. history. The fighting dragged on for weeks, erasing entire villages under nonstop artillery fire. Despite taking heavy casualties, the Allies just kept pushing. And the reality was, Germany had absolutely no reserves left to stop them. Every retreat just bled their army drier. And that leads us to part 4. The empire collapses. While the front lines are crumbling, the German Empire itself was imploding from within. A relentless British naval blockade had absolutely crippled the German economy, causing these severe food shortages where entire cities were literally facing starvation. You had desperate, hungry workers going on mass strikes. And the collapse of discipline wasn't just among civilians, it reached the military itself. This all culminated in the infamous Kiel Mutiny, where sailors in the German Navy outright refused orders for what they saw as a suicidal final battle. The German people simply refused to fight any longer. The tank was on empty. When you look back at it, it is truly mind-boggling how incredibly fast this all unraveled. In March, Germany launches the largest offensive of the war, threatening Paris itself. By July, they are stopped dead in their tracks at the Marne. In August, the devastating Allied push begins. And by November, the entire political structure of the country collapses. Just 8 months. 8 months from a massive, terrifying surge to total, absolute ruin. The writing was on the wall. The monarchy was finished. On November 9th, 1918, recognizing that his empire had completely collapsed beneath him, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated the throne and fled to the Netherlands. The German monarchy, which had directed the country through the greatest conflict the world had ever seen to that point, was just gone. A new civilian government took the reins, and they knew they had absolutely zero leverage. They had to seek peace immediately, no matter the cost. And that brings us to the final quiet moments of this brutal chapter. Germany's armies were retreating, the emperor had fled, and the people were demanding an end to the suffering. On November 11th, 1918, the famous armistice was signed, and the guns finally went silent. The greatest war the world had ever seen was over. But as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to chew on. The fighting stopped, sure, but an agreement had to be made to shape the future of Europe. Looking at the total devastation and the incredibly heavy cost exacted upon a newly collapsed Germany, we have to ask ourselves, did the resulting peace treaty that ended this unimaginable bloodshed unknowingly plant the seeds for an even deadlier conflict just a couple of decades later? It's a critical question to keep in mind as you digest everything we've covered today.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are looking at this massive historical paradox. We're going to unpack how the agonizing end of the First World War actually laid the exact groundwork for the Second. It's a really stark lesson in how a flawed peace can frankly be just as deadly as the war itself. Let's dive right in.
So, picture this. The year is 1918. For over 4 years, the world had been witnessing destruction on a scale no one had ever even imagined. We're talking empires completely fallen, entire cities reduced to absolute rubble, and families all over the globe mourning fathers, sons, brothers, and husbands who were never coming home. Try to imagine the sheer, exhausted relief spreading across nations as the guns finally prepared to fall silent. But, as you'll see, finding a lasting peace? Well, that would prove to be way more complicated than actually fighting the war.
Section 1. The 11th Hour.
Okay, so by November 1918, Germany had hit its absolute breaking point. I mean, its armies were in full retreat, the economy had completely collapsed, people were starving in the streets, and the Kaiser had officially abdicated. So in this totally frantic sequence of events, German representatives basically had to travel to this railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in France to meet with Allied commanders. The terms they were handed were brutal, but honestly, Germany had literally no other choice. So at 5:10 a.m. on November 11th, the armistice was officially signed. The fighting was set to finally end at 11 a.m., the famous 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month.
But here is the incredibly tragic reality of that specific morning. For 6 long hours, soldiers basically just waited.
But the crazy thing is, some commanders actually ordered the fighting to continue right up until the very last minute. Thousands of guys were wounded or killed during this bizarre little 6-hour window, literally dying for ground that they knew was going to be peaceful just hours later. And then, right at 11 a.m., the guns finally fell silent. After more than 4 horrific years, World War I was actually over.
Section 2. A devastating human cost.
Now, while church bells were ringing and strangers were literally hugging each other in the streets across Europe, right behind every single celebration was just this absolute ocean of grief. 70 million. Take a second to process that number. That's the staggering amount of military personnel who served globally. This wasn't just some local battlefield. This was a massive conflict that touched pretty much every single corner of the earth.
And the toll it took? Honestly, it's almost unfathomable. 10 million soldiers killed in action, plus millions more civilians completely wiped out by famine, disease, and violence. Just think about what that actually means on a human level. Entire generations were just erased. There were some villages that lost literally every single young man they had. No one left.
But, the suffering didn't just end with the casualties. 20 million more soldiers returned home wounded. Imagine them walking back into these emptied-out villages, carrying permanent physical injuries that were going to completely alter the trajectory of their lives forever.
And of course, not all wounds were visible, right? Countless veterans carried around this incredibly deep psychological trauma. What we nowadays recognize as PTSD haunted an entire generation long after 1918. And that mental toll was just as catastrophic as the physical ruins they left behind.
Section 3. The Flawed Peace.
So, fast forward to 1919. Allied leaders gather in Paris with what sounds like a simple mission: create a lasting peace. But actually pulling off that monumental task, it was incredibly disjointed, because every single nation wanted something completely different. It's like a giant puzzle where none of the pieces fit together. France, for instance, demanded really strict security and harsh punishment to protect its borders. Britain wanted to protect its empire. And meanwhile, you have the United States, led by President Woodrow Wilson, envisioning this grand, cooperative international order to end all wars.
The final result of all these conflicting visions was signed exactly 5 years to the day after the assassination that sparked the whole shebang. We know it as the Treaty of Versailles. And the conditions? They were highly restrictive and just deeply, deeply punitive. Germany was basically forced to accept full responsibility, they lost territory, had to dismantle their military, and pay these absolutely crippling financial reparations. For everyday Germans, this didn't feel like peace at all, it just felt like punishment. And historically speaking, this was essentially the first major domino falling right toward the next global conflict.
Now, President Wilson's really big, grand idea from that Paris conference was the League of Nations. Think of it as an international diplomatic group specifically designed to resolve disputes through talking rather than bloodshed. Sounds great, right? But in a massive twist of tragic irony, the United States Senate actually refused to join. So without America's participation and power backing it up, the League was fatally weakened right from day one. It was basically left totally powerless to stop any future aggression.
Section 4. Seeds of another war. Right after this whole peace process wrapped up, this intense feeling of deep humiliation and resentment just spread like wildfire throughout a struggling, fractured Germany. A lot of people at the time genuinely believed World War I had been the war to end all wars. You'd probably heard that famous hopeful phrase. But as we know now, the fragile, really punitive peace they just built was about to prove the exact opposite.
Inside Germany, the economic shockwaves from Versailles were just deafening. You had crushing national debt and this wild hyperinflation that completely wiped out the life savings of everyday normal citizens almost overnight. And you know what happens when people lose their livelihoods? They tend to lose faith in democracy. It created this absolutely perfect, fertile breeding ground for political extremists to swoop in and gain widespread support.
And capitalizing exactly on that widespread despair, a former German soldier named Adolf Hitler stepped right into the spotlight. He promised to restore Germany's shattered pride, and he did it by pointing the finger directly at the Treaty of Versailles for all of their immense suffering. His rhetoric ended up attracting millions of followers, and within just 2 decades, Europe found itself once again marching straight toward war.
Look at the sheer scale of the geopolitical legacy left behind by this conflict. It's wild. 4 of the world's great powers, the German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, just completely disappeared. Poof, gone.
This massive collapse literally erased old borders and forged entirely new nations all across Europe and the Middle East. It fundamentally reshaped the modern map of the world as we know it.
But alongside those shifting borders came some pretty profound technological leaps. Because of the desperate need for any kind of battlefield advantage, innovations like aircraft, tanks, chemical weapons, radio comms, and even modern medicine evolved at an absolute breakneck speed. These advancements forever changed not just military strategy, but literally our daily lives.
So, stepping back from it all, a really direct, undeniable cause and effect timeline starts to emerge. Think about it. A single assassination in 1914 sparked a massive war, which then ended with a deeply flawed peace agreement in 1919. The Second World War didn't just manifest out of thin air in 1939, right? Its roots stretched directly back to the very treaty that was supposed to meant to ensure lasting peace.
Which leaves us with a really profound question to wrap up this explainer today. Do wars begin with a single, loud event, or do they start with small, quiet decisions that just slowly spiral beyond our control? Even more than a century later, the lessons of World War I still matter so much to all of us today. It reminds us that peace is incredibly fragile, and the decisions we make in the aftermath of a conflict, well, they can shape the destiny of entire generations. Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep questioning the stories that shape our world.